Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Why don't we go ahead and get started? First, I want to thank you for joining us today for this presentation of the discussion brief on better integration of nutrition into resilient strengthening programs. My name is Tom Spangler, and I work with Save the Children as Activity Director for the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, Learning, or REAL Award, through which this work has been carried out. I'll ask Emily to paste a link in the chat box to a webpage where you can access more detailed information on and learning products developed through the REAL Award. For those familiar with REAL's work over the past several years, you'll know that our primary objective is to provide rigorous yet practical monitoring, evaluation, strategic analysis, and capacity building support to RFS counterparts, or I should say the USAID Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security counterparts, USAID missions, host governments, implementing organizations, and other key stakeholders engaged in resilience programming. Today's presentation will be given by Dr. Nancy Mock of Tulane University and Joan Jennings, Senior Nutrition Advisor for Save the Children. They'll be giving an overview of the issues presented in the discussion paper, including fundamental concepts linking nutrition and resilience, the role of nutrition as both a contributor to and a key outcome of resilience, and the need to further integrate nutrition and resilience analysis to strengthen future programming. Before we get started, I need to review a few technical instructions for this morning's session to make sure we use our time as efficiently as possible. First, please remain on mute when you're not speaking, and click the Zoom reactions button to raise your hand or if you'd like to speak. If you'd like to view captions or live transcript of the presentations, you can click the bottom of your screen on the button that says CC. Also note that we are recording today's webinar and we'll be sharing the recording in the next few days for those unable to attend. If at any time you need tech support during the meeting, please just reach out to either Emily or Katie through the chat box. The presentation today will be followed by a Q&A session and an interactive activity. And during these times, we encourage you to raise your hand with the Zoom reactions to ask your questions live, or you can also pose your questions and comments using the Q&A function in Zoom, which you'll see at the bottom of your window. Now, to get started, we're hoping to make today's discussion as interactive as possible. And toward that end, we thought we'd kick things off with a quick poll. So you'll see options come up in your Zoom screen, and we'd just like to hear from you all as participants. What technical area do you feel most comfortable with? Is it nutrition? Is it resilience? Do you feel equally comfortable with both? Or maybe there's another technical sector or practice that you feel most comfortable with. Please enter your responses. We'll give you a few seconds to do that. When you're finished, we'll ask everyone also to please remember to introduce yourself using the chat box. Enter your name, your role, and your organization when you have time, please. Okay. It looks like, I think everyone can see these results. It looks like, at least for those who've responded, we've got a pretty good mix and an even balance, which is exactly what we would hope for this discussion. We've got participants, obviously, that are experienced in nutrition, resilience, and a handful of others as well. So we should have very rich and lively discussion on what will be presented today. So I do want to thank you again for joining us. We do hope that you'll find the discussion both relevant and helpful for your work. Without further ado, I'll pass it off to Madeline Smith for opening remarks. Madeline serves as a Resilience Integration Advisor for the USAID Center for Resilience within the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. Madeline, over to you.
Great, thank you, Tom. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all. Thanks for joining this discussion with us today on behalf of the Bureau for newly named Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. As Tom said, my name is Madeline Smith. I'm the Resilience Integration Advisor and sit on the Center for Resilience. So it's my pleasure to introduce this discussion with the USAID team.
Everyone is muted now, Madeline. You can proceed.
Okay, sorry about that. So it's my pleasure to introduce this discussion with the USAID Real team and other colleagues from the Center for Nutrition, as well as Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance that worked on this discussion brief with us. We hope that this discussion is going to be an opportunity to advance our thought leadership and evidence base around nutrition and resilience. So we published this discussion note last year, and we have shared it a couple times in some targeted forums, including most recently in the Resilience Evidence Forum that took place in Cape Town last June. But now we want to use this opportunity to engage a broader public, other USAID colleagues that are engaged in nutrition, resilience, and as we learned, both or other sectors, just to hear some more of your thoughts and discuss some potential ideas for advancing this work. You may have noticed that in the strategic framework for the USAID Global Food Security Strategy, that resilience and nutrition are both at the strategic objective level. And so while we know that it's usually quite difficult, we want to make sure that we're looking at this as an integrated framework, and that these two objectives are integrated in practice and in our evidence base. And one thing I just wanted to note too, resilience and nutrition both really have one thing in common. They both require a multi-sectoral approach to achieve our desired outcomes, being just one of them. And it also makes it a little bit more complex and challenging. So we know that well-nourished individuals and communities are by nature more resilient to shocks and stresses. At the same time, many things in our evidence base on resilience show that sources of resilience, like financial capital, social capital, women's empowerment, a healthy, environment, all of these things also really contribute to better nutritional outcomes. But we still need to build a stronger evidence base that explores the relationship between sources of resilience, nutrition sensitive and specific outcomes, and all of those systems that are necessary to more effectively and systematically maintain nutritional status in the face of shocks and stresses. In the longer term, investments in nutrition, as well as health, education, they're all necessary to decrease intergenerational transmission of poverty, malnutrition, and build human capital and economic growth for future generations. So this discussion note represents an excellent first step in REAL's efforts to better integrate nutrition and resilience approaches. I just want to finish by extending our thanks to REAL, Nancy Mock, Joan Jennings, Emily Marshall, and Tom Spangler, who developed this discussion note, and also to the USAID staff from the Bureau for Resilience, former Resilience and Food Security, Center for Resilience, the Center for Nutrition, and BHA that worked on this, Ingrid Wise, Sean Wozniak, Michael Mansky, and Leslie Koo. So before handing this over to REAL, just going to finish with a couple of questions that we'd like you to consider during the presentation. And as Tom noted at the end, we have a short interactive section where we'll be coming back to these. So the first question is, what are the information gaps related to integrating nutrition and resilience programming? And secondly, what activities or organizations are generating evidence to fill these information gaps? So with that, I will hand it over to Nancy Mock to kick off the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time zone you're in. I'm actually in the central time zone, so it's a little early for me. I'm wanted to give a few comments about my background and how I ended up here working on this topic. As early as 1983, I was probably the first to document the complexity of understanding wasting and stunting and their correlations and lack of correlations. And I proceeded in my early career to work on the co-creation of the FUSE program, now the the FUSE Network program. And for those of you in the nutrition world, Ann Ralte and I actually were the instigators of the SMART initiative, the Standardized Monitoring and Assessment of Relief and Transitions. In fact, we coined the term, came up with the title. It took us a while, but I think it stuck. And I had early on embarked in the resilience measurement movement, working with various technical working groups and expert groups on that topic as well. So as I looked at many of the resilience programs and also nutrition programs, it became obvious to me that there wasn't enough of an integration of the concepts of nutrition and resilience, and that was a really unfortunate missed opportunity. So that's sort of the background for how I and the center started, and Joan started to actually get into this topic. And the brief that I encourage you to read is a brief. It's not long, it's not wordy, but it attempts to really flesh out these concepts and provide a first cut at understanding how they're interrelated. And as Madeline mentioned, optimal nutrition is fundamental to achieving USAID's wider mission. It's at the both at the strategic objective level. And we'll see in a moment that nutrition is both an input to resilience and an important outcome, and it's not often measured nor analyzed in resilience strengthening activities. Nutrition-specific interventions address the immediate causes of malnutrition, such as vitamin A supplementation, or the promotion of biofortified foods, and nutrition-sensitive interventions address the underlying causes. And all of these are important for improving nutrition. Next, please. This is a table of contents that provides you with an overview of what the brief looks like, but it basically fleshes out a few frameworks relating nutrition to shock exposure and also resilience to nutrition. And so these the brief also looks at initiatives and some of the programming concepts, and finally, ultimately looking at further research needs. Next, please. So my colleague Joan insisted that we include this slide, which I absolutely agree with. You know, in both the nutrition world and particularly in the resilience world, there's often pessimism about how we can crack this nut and actually improve nutritional status. And indeed, we have to keep in mind that although malnutrition, and particularly global acute malnutrition, is really a threat and a persistent problem in many parts of the world, most people are not malnourished, and even during crises, they are not. So we have to remain optimistic that we can actually solve the problem, that we can improve sustainably nutritional status in the context of shocks and stresses, and that we need to better identify factors and strategic pathways to do that. Next, please. So one of the things to think about really, and resilience is all about the shock and stress environment and understanding that, and also understanding the capacities and the potential capacities that systems, people, communities have to mitigate those shocks. So if you wanted to look at the pathways through which shocks affect malnutrition and increased malnutrition, you can see that a variety of shocks, a large variety actually, and they're getting larger all the time. The shock and stress environment, unfortunately, seems to be getting worse and more complex. But it results in compromised environmental systems, compromised food systems, population displacement. These things result in interrupted and or reduced access to quality services, to an area that we'll talk a little bit about, but is a box that really needs expanding, relating to the psychological effects of shock exposure, trauma and depression, and compromised and overwhelmed emergency response and recovery systems. So these are all results of shocks. And then at the lowest level, it results in decreased dietary intake and an increased burden of disease that lead to increased malnutrition and mortality. Next, please. Now, this is USAID's resilience conceptual framework that we've now updated to include nutrition and resilience. But it's the framework with a nutrition lens, and it's not comprehensive in terms of all of the factors that are important, but it looks first, and I like to focus on the outcomes, the well-being outcomes. You know, what is it that we want to achieve through developing resilience capacities? And well-being outcomes that we typically measure have to do with household food security. However, nutritional outcomes are incredibly important to really making this link between relief and development. Hello?
Hi, Nancy, you can continue.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So nutrition is one of those well-being outcomes that is important, is critically important. How many of you know, or would you want to just insert in the chat, what is one of the most important indicators in the Integrated Phase Classification Scheme, the IPC? You just want to throw some votes in the chat. Anyone? Yes, wasting.
Again.
Yes.
Again.
Yes, I think you've nailed it. High GAM and mortality are among the most important and you know, undeniable signals that there are humanitarian emergencies. So if you look at the bottom right hand in the box, you see that high GAM and humanitarian caseloads and mortality are like a very unfortunate result of shocks and stresses where where nutrition is not mitigated. And this is our typical humanitarian emergency. So GAM is a very important indicator. And in looking at resilience pathways when shocks occur, we can either see high GAM and humanitarian caseloads, or we can see compromised gains in nutritional development. That's what we're probably where we are now in most cases. Or we can see outcomes that are more positive, like maintained nutritional status, or improved nutritional status and decreased nutritional vulnerability. So those are some of the outcomes, and the measures that we would like to see more often monitored are anthropometry and dietary indicators, individual dietary indicators, mothers, children, and adolescents. So those are the well-being outcomes. And if we go back through the framework, you notice that on the other side, nutritional vulnerability is an input to resilience. And so looking at pre-shock stunning and wasting and chronic energy deficiency, cost of healthy diets and distressed diets, these are all vulnerability factors that are inputs to resilience. And if we look at the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities, these are the resilience capacities that we are most concerned about in resilience parlance. We look at, in terms of nutrition, caretaker nutritional competence, the ability of caretakers to take care of children and adolescents. Household monitoring, the ability of households to understand if nutrition is actually a risk in their household. We look at structures such as scalable, robust community management of acute malnutrition. An area I think is very underappreciated in terms of its impact on the outcomes, actually. There's pretty reasonable evidence that in the case of Kenya, for example, the ability of the government to scale in collaboration with UNICEF CMAM programs did not prevent high GAM, but it prevented mortality. So a step in the right direction. So structures that can actually mitigate nutritional impacts and the worst outcomes for malnutrition, food systems, and then strategies that within resilience and nutrition programming, nutrition sensitive social protection, high nutrient density in agriculture, and a very important one, combining behavioral and livelihood interventions. That is taking a more ecological approach to behavioral change and realizing that many of the traditional resilience oriented interventions can really provide enabling environments for people to sustain behavioral change. Next, please. Now, these are just some examples of absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities. Nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive shock responsive safety net services that are particularly linked with maternal and child health care. That is, these types of linkages amplify the nutritional impacts of interventions. Adaptive capacities, promoting the cultivation of nutrient-dense, drought-tolerant crops, access to financial services, and sustainable management of natural resources. And then a big one, strengthening women's economic and social roles. We know that this is a nutrition sensitive intervention that makes a very large difference in terms of mitigating the effects of shocks and stresses. And then transformative. And here, these capacities are ones that are major changes in systems and in culture. And we know that many of the problems in the most vulnerable areas of the world, the drylands in Africa and areas of Southeast Asia, is this notion that there are many social norms that really prevent sustainable change, behavioral change, and constrain nutritional improvement. Next, please. Yeah. Now, in terms of, those are some of the specific components or linkages that that link the ideas of resilience and nutrition programming. But there's a bigger one, and this really is the movement towards humanitarian development and peace coherence, something that's talked about a lot, that's not necessarily executed very well in many places, but it's truly important for improving resilience and nutrition outcomes. And the importance here is that with a dynamic risk context in shock-prone countries, and particularly very vulnerable populations, it takes a lot of resources to try to fix that problem. And so HDP, as it's often referred to, coherence, means that USAID and other donors adopt more of a portfolio approaches where they try to integrate these different types of programs that sometimes it goes beyond internal to donors itself. It should, to multi-donor approaches and leveraging of relationships to enable different stakeholders to sequence, layer, and integrate to ensure consumption stability, and that social behavioral change and some of these more difficult things are actually layered and integrated so that they can be sustained. And another important one, as I had mentioned earlier, is the need to prepare to scale up nutrition-specific interventions during shocks. Now, ultimately, we hope to get out of that business. But in the short run, we know that we have areas of the world with very high underlying levels of acute malnutrition and chronic malnutrition. In some cases, GAM rates typically are 20%, which is above the emergency threshold. So we've got to understand that these areas are particularly vulnerable to rapid deterioration of nutrition in relation to shocks. So being able to scale up nutrition-specific interventions, particularly the management of acute malnutrition, is quite important. And as I said, Kenya was a very good example of how a government took that on, supported by UNICEF, and has done a good job. These sorts of cases needed to be further looked at, and others as well. And then seek opportunities to strengthen and prioritize shock-responsive, nutrition-sensitive interventions. And as you all know, during COVID, we got exposed to the fact that sometimes we're too shock-centric, unique shock-centric, when we look at the management of shocks, and epidemics was the example with COVID. COVID had, in many cases, relatively minimal effects as a disease, but the response to COVID had major implications for food security and nutrition. Next, please. So, key point, resilience strengthening initiatives must focus deliberately on improving nutritional status in nutritionally vulnerable populations through nutrition sensitive and specific interventions. Next. And a very key point, there has been some effort to include nutritional measures in monitoring and impact evaluations. However, these are not good enough. So we really do need to be measuring and monitoring nutritional status in the face of shocks and stresses, and particularly looking at going beyond household food security measures. So we need to move beyond that to anthropometry, to individual dietary intake, i.e. women, children, adolescents. And we need to analyze relationships between coping mechanisms and outcomes. That is, we need to better understand the dynamics of shock exposure, coping behaviors, and ultimately how that affects nutritional status. Next, please. So future directions. We do think additional mining of existing data sets, impact recurrent monitoring systems can be useful. We also want to see if, in fact, we have examples where resilience is increased to the extent that we don't need CMAM in these tertiary responses. And thirdly, what else is needed to better integrate nutrition into resilience programming for meaningful improvements, to really look at those strategic pathways in context that lead to improvement in nutrition and resilience. I think that's it. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for sharing that presentation, Nancy. We do have a few questions trickling in. Before I pose those, I want to encourage others. If you have questions about anything that Nancy shared thus far, please use the Q&A function to enter those questions, and we'll do as best we can to get responses to them. The first we received, Nancy, was from Lisa Keenan Asfaw at CRS and is asking, would you please share any HDP coherent examples of actions that incorporate peace related to promoting improved nutrition and resilience? The P in HDP is often the most difficult to grasp in some ways. Could you respond to that with any examples? And this includes you, Joan. If you have any examples, I'm sure you do, that might be relevant.
Yeah, this actually has been difficult because the peace interventions are often very sectoralized, right? And so I think there are some like emergent examples, maybe in the Sahel, where that's being done because of backbone projects. You know, Sahel has a backbone project, which I'm involved with. And they, the idea there is really trying to make that integration happen. There's some evidence that it's happening, but it could go, I would say, worldwide. That's an issue that needs a lot more emphasis and a lot more work. I think the social cohesion angle of it opens it up to a broader consideration beyond just the peace building community. And I think that's a positive step as well. Joan, I don't know, do you have anything to add on that?
No, unfortunately, most of the positive aspects of peace that we see are not carried out by, they're carried out by local government. But it does make a dramatic difference when people feel secure and can go about and do their livelihood activities. And I was just going to point out that Madeline posted a link to a document on HDP coherence programming examples in the chat box.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Joan, and thanks for sharing it, Madeline. Turning to our next question, we have a question from Gwen Ellen O'Donnell at CARE and asking, could we please clarify, something was mentioned related to the COVID-19 epidemic having a relatively low impact on disease, but significant impact on nutrition outcomes. And we weren't really clear on that point and wanted it clarified if you could, Nancy.
Yeah, so, you know, COVID initially particularly was treated as a health emergency, really where most of the efforts and interventions went to stopping disease transmission. And a lot of the initial responses of governments were things like lockdowns, right? And border closures. And those tended to, where they were enforced well, they tended to have a particularly pernicious effect on low-income people who typically work in the informal sector and need to actually physically move around to earn money. So the other piece of this was that in many low-income countries, the epidemic wasn't widespread, not in the way, for a number of reasons, not in the way it was in high-income countries. And it had to do with the age structure of the population, with the chronic disease burden in high-income countries, and other things. So basically, the epidemic itself wasn't really didn't cause the worst impact. It was actually the actions that we're taking, the lockdowns and the border closures and such, that really disrupted people's livelihoods. So that's why I made that statement. Therefore, the nutritional impacts in some cases were quite high, and also the livelihood impacts. So in general, it affected resilience.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, for that response, Gwenellen. I hope that was helpful. Moving on to the next question. It's from Sarah Higgins at CRS, asking, can you speak to examples of strengthening the enabling environment for transformative capacity? Any efforts in terms of policy coherence around integrated nutrition and resilience that you can share?
What was the last part of it? Sorry.
Examples of policy coherence. I think speaking to transformative capacity, I know policy that's jointly aimed at strengthening resilience and nutrition may be lacking, but any examples you have to share of where that might be happening would be helpful.
Well, I think policy, well, I'll go to the last part first. The policy coherence around shock responsive safety nets, that's a big one, right? That really, and the way then that those are implemented, I think is really important. It's one of the areas of development that has enormous potential to ultimately reduce the burden of acute malnutrition in the face of shocks. And especially when it's also targeted appropriately. So that's, I think, one example. This enabling environment for SBC, I mean, for social behavioral change, I actually think some of the better examples right now are at the more micro level, where you see, for example, care groups being integrated with savings groups, where the enabling environment is economic empowerment for women that's paired with social behavioral change interventions, so that really there's a more of a possibility for sustainment of behavioral change, and where ultimately that can transform at sort of a smaller scale norms on the value of women.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. We've got another question here that is posed by Temeskin Valeta. It's got a short background. I'll read that and then get to the question. Temeskin says, resilience is an interface between humanitarian emergency and long-term development programming. And because both resilience and nutrition require multi-sectoral interventions, as Madeline noted, we all agree that integrating these two principles is critical. However, insertion of nutrition components into resilience programming, we don't think, or Temeskin feels that we don't see things happening as anticipated in practice in implementation of these programs. So the question is, what are the unique barriers from your experience that hinder organizations from effectively integrating nutrition and resilience programming? And what do you see as the key opportunities for this triple nexus of HDP coherence and nutrition and resilience programming?
Mindset.
Big question. If you can try your best to share a response, that would be useful.
Mindsets. Mindsets are a barrier. Bureaucracies are a barrier in terms of how humanitarian development and peace building interventions are and nutrition interventions are administered. Who runs them? Who administers them? They're bureaucratic barriers related to project cycles and such. So there are a number of barriers, but the most important one is mindset. The nutrition community, which I've been a part of over the years, tends to be a little bit provincial, and the resilience community, and we're all in resilience, right? But the community that's developed around resilience also has become a bit sectoralized. So I think it's mindsets, and I think if the mindsets are in the right place, then those bureaucratic barriers can be broken down and worked on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nancy. We're going to try to address at least a couple more questions before we turn to our last session for today. This question is from Carmen Say, and the question is, could you expand your thoughts that you alluded to on the last slide on whether wasting levels could improve with resilience programming and whether in the absence of CMEM? And Carmen is wondering about targeting in resilience interventions for nutrition outcomes as well. I hope that question is clear.
Yeah, well, certainly the first one. So my thought is on that in those areas of the world where persistent GAM is a feature, high levels, 15% above in GAM, it probably does still require us to be able to scale up these interventions to address, specifically address acute malnutrition. But as we move people to, to situations where that's not a feature anymore, or we're lower in terms of the GAM rates levels, then I think we should be seeing those, So, I guess my point is that we have to, one of our resilience strategies right now to protect nutrition is to do these scale ups in areas that have very high levels of persistent malnutrition. And hopefully we can get out of that business, but it's probably not going to be in the near-term future. In areas where persistent malnutrition is not such a key feature, I would expect that we wouldn't need that necessarily. And that's going to be in middle income, contexts and such. That'd be my first take on it. It's a great question.
It is a great question. Thank you for sharing that and all the other questions. We've got just a couple more that we won't have time to get to because we need to turn to our last session. And this is where we want to get more broad input from all of you on some of these outstanding priorities that Madeline referred to earlier. You can either scan this QR code that you see on the screen with your phone, or you can click the link in the chat to join the interactive presentation in your internet browser. See, the link is there. So again, once you have time to go to these go to this AHA slide link, we're going to revisit these initial questions that Madeline posed at the top of today's webinar. First question that we'd love your feedback on, and you can use the internet or the AHA slides to enter your responses on that. What are the information gaps related to integration, nutrition, and resilience programming? By this, we mean, what are your priority needs in terms of additional research and learning that can help provide some insight into these linkages? We'll give you a few moments to respond. See, folks are still typing. Please do keep it coming. These are great responses that we have thus far. Okay, while these questions are coming in, Nancy and Joan, I'll give you free rein. I think you can look at them and respond to them. We see very common questions that we have that are general to, say, resilience measurement and nutrition analysis. And then we've got some very great specific and pointed questions, some of which have been raised already. Go ahead,
I think
Nancy.
there's a cluster of responses that get at a very important point, which is that, we can't do everything. We can't do everything that's needed for everyone, but we can change nutritional outcomes if we look at some of the key drivers in a particular context. And so that gets at this question of first or second order, sequencing approaches and so forth. And those will be context specific. What's driving malnutrition in one context is different than what it is in another area. So it's the idea being that, take some of those approaches. And I would say there are two things. One is looking at critical paths to malnutrition. And then the other is looking at resilience-oriented interventions that have a lot of traction and appeal to populations that get them on board quickly. So that can be things like savings groups, for example, very popular one. But looking in, and that one tends to be actually pretty popular in many places. So looking at where there are really big entry points for populations in terms of felt need and interventions that address that felt need, and pairing that with what you know about strategic pathways to malnutrition. For example, if you have a savings group and you know that infant feeding behaviors are really poor, that's a good pairing. That might be a good pairing of interventions. So I would say that's a really important question. And I think it's context specific, and we should do a lot more work to understand how to identify these strategic interventions that can build resilience and nutrition. Scalable project models. They exist in some places in terms of, as I mentioned, Kenya. And I think we felt until recently that Ethiopia was another good example. But there are some out there. And there are, and I think, some really important bright spots where countries pick up a pilot that an NGO undertakes and picks it up into national policy. That's really where scalability is very, that's where the action is on that, where they take it up as policy and they leverage their access to international resources to implement that policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. You can see for yourself how these questions kind of might be grouped together. I think we can choose from a few to respond to. There are a few around specific populations. So how can we best target populations outside of, say, women and children under 5, including those that are most vulnerable, including those that may have challenges in participating in interventions? There are also a number of questions around indicators. Of course, we want and need to generate evidence around this, but the indicators on which we do that is an ongoing discussion. Maybe you can speak to either of those questions.
Well, safety net programs typically, so shock responsive safety nets may, they often have a component that deals with the chronically vulnerable, and so that a lot of these, if you have a robust safety net program, that it often deals with those groups with special needs. So that's one answer there. And then on the indicators, can you show me which of the?
I have questions. There's one on indicators for forecasting risk. There are questions about just how we generate evidence that our nutrition and resilience strengthening interventions are working, both towards resilience capacities and improved nutrition outcomes. So yeah, I think just a general area of questions. how do we select indicators to best measure integrated approaches to resilience strengthening and nutrition?
Well, one thing is that we need to be measuring nutritional status more and analyzing it. And that is, anthropometrics, if you have other biometrics, but not necessarily just household food security, but individual dietary intake. So to me, those are things that need to be more routinely incorporated into monitoring and impact evaluations to better understand these linkages. And forecasting risk, there are some countries that are doing that. Ethiopia was, by looking at a variety of indicators of food insecurity in terms of predicting nutritional risk. The interesting thing that is often kind of conceptually confused, that is, we don't take advantage enough of routine monitoring and health facilities of nutrition, well, baby visits and so forth. And some of those clinics actually identify rising malnutrition. So in places like Ethiopia, they've actually looked at forecasting risk using that kind of information. So the conceptual piece of it is that people say, well, it's a trailing indicator. By the time you're seeing it, you're kind of late. But on the other hand, if you're monitoring very vulnerable populations, as you start to see it, you often see it very early in the, in a shock situation. And of course, we do know the geographic areas that are at risk of having excessive GAM rates. We know where they are,
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for these questions and for that thoughtful response, Nancy. I'm sorry to
cut it off.
shrift or need to cut off, but I'm mindful of time as well. And we've got a couple of good questions that we won't have time to get to today, but they will not be ignored. All of this feedback is really helpful for us, and I'm sure others that can see questions entered. What we want to do now in the time remaining is turn to this last question that Madeline posed for your feedback on. If you could use the AHA slides, enter what you know about what activities or organizations are currently generating evidence to fill these information gaps. Of course, we as RIO want to coordinate with them, and we want to help contribute to continued learning on this. So we'd love your thoughts on who is doing important research and learning in this area. And this does not need to be definitive. We're just asking for what you know of which projects are engaged in integrated resilience and nutrition programming, where, who are they implemented by, who might they be coordinating with. Any of this would be helpful for us. And here in the time remaining, in addition to those who are typing responses, I'll encourage anybody courageous enough to come off mute and explain what you know, who's doing what, where. I see obviously that WFP and UNICEF are very active in this area. Yes, specific projects, geographic locations, what their research questions might be would be really helpful.
Yeah, Joan is actually involved in the RIFSAs in Kenya. And we know there should be very, very useful evidence coming out of the Kenya RIFSAs.
Yes, and I will say, I think in the time that we have remaining, that among next steps is to look at available data sources to do some of this analysis that may not have been carried out yet. So likewise, if you know of any ongoing research projects or available data sets, that would be useful as well. Noting FAO's work on REMA assessments and ideals and HDP coherence, yes, all very relevant. Thank you. And see the note to prioritize looking at the local level in coordination with missions. So yes, very much noted.
Can't see the rest of the get local box. I don't know, Tom, if
Yeah, Katie, I'm not sure if there's any way to expand the view to see that entire
Oh,
response.
good,
Thank
yeah.
you. Okay, all of this is tremendously helpful. Again, not wanting to cut this off, but I'm just looking at my own clock and realizing that we're coming to the end of the hour. So again, I want to say we're very grateful to everyone who's joined today and contributed to this very helpful and rich discussion. In terms of next steps, REAL will continue to work closely with the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security on this really important work stream. Our next step is to carry out, and in fact, we've already started on this, is to carry out evaluability assessments of existing data sets to determine which include the relevant indicators on sources of resilience capacities and nutrition outcomes. So that is in progress. When we have a kind of a fuller set of data to apply to this question, we'd like to facilitate further consultations with technical experts engaged in nutrition and resilience to identify priority research questions for secondary analysis. And then we'll carry out that secondary analysis to identify convergent and complementary sources of strengthened resilience and improved nutrition outcomes. So I think, as many of you might appreciate, I think the progress, the pace with which we advance through these steps will be somewhat contingent on available resources, but we hope to share findings from the secondary analysis of nutrition and resilience data sets in mid-2024. And I think with that, we're right at time. That brings us for a close for today. But for those interested, we've added links to a range of relevant resources on resilience measurement that we hope you'll find useful. And before you go, we do ask that you please take just a few minutes to fill out a participant survey for today's session. You can find that through the link. This will definitely help us get better at these types of events in the future. So thank you very much for your time today. We hope it's been useful, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.